Snow fell in heavy, deliberate flakes as I arrived at Willow Ridge. Its black iron gates loomed ahead, half buried under drifts of snow, as though nature itself sought to obscure the path. The surrounding village sparkled with festive lights and carolers' distant melodies, but here, the air carried a weight of long-forgotten memories. I gripped the strap of my bag and stepped forward, feeling as though the house had been waiting for me. The mansion stood at the end of the long, frozen path, its jagged silhouette cutting sharply against the dull gray sky. Its windows were clouded, their glass smeared with time. For years, I'd heard the tales, a woman seen weeping in the uppermost window, lights flickering on in rooms left untouched for decades, the faint sound of music seeping from within on this very night, every year. I had been warned. My editor, my friends, even the shopkeeper who sold me the sturdy lantern I carried now. No one stays the night, they had said. But as a journalist, and perhaps a hopeless romantic for a good story, I could not resist the allure of uncovering the truth. The latch on the gate creaked under my gloved hand, breaking the stillness. The path leading to the front door was uneven, the cobblestones cracked, revealing patches of earth below. I reached the great wooden doors, their once grand carvings now faded and warped. A strange compulsion overtook me. I raised the heavy brass knocker and let it fall. The sound reverberated through the air, but no answer came. I wasn't expecting one. Still, something about the silence felt too absolute. I pushed the door open and stepped into the cold embrace of the entry hall. The interior was a cavern of darkness, with only faint streaks of light from the windows above filtering in. The air smelled of damp wood and something else, something faintly sweet and decayed. Dust blanketed the furniture, but the shapes of opulence remained: ornate chairs, gilded frames on peeling wallpaper, a grand staircase that ascended into obscurity. As I closed the door behind me, the wind caught it, slamming it shut with such force that the sound echoed through the halls like a gunshot. I startled, the lantern shaking in my grasp. It was then that I heard it, the faintest strain of music. It was coming from the drawing room, the sound distant but unmistakable. I hesitated, the hair on my arms standing on end, but my curiosity pressed me forward. Pushing the door open, I found the room empty, save for a grand piano cloaked in a thick sheet. The melody lingered, soft and melancholic, as though the pianist had just left. The sheet rippled. Not by the wind, there was no draft, but something moved beneath it, something small and purposeful. My breath caught as I stepped closer, my boots crunching over broken glass. I reached out a trembling hand and pulled the sheet away in one quick motion. Nothing. The piano stood silent, its keys untouched and ivory sheen dulled by dust. I felt foolish for my apprehension until I noticed the footprints. Small and childlike, they led from the piano across the room and stopped abruptly at the base of the grand mirror. It stood tall and cracked, reflecting not only the room but a version of it that seemed sharper, alive with a faint glow of candlelight. And then, as I stared into the glass, my own reflection wavered. Behind me, where there should have been only empty space, a figure appeared, a man in a tattered suit, his face shrouded in shadow, his hand reaching toward me. I spun around. There was nothing there. Only the oppressive silence of the room. I turned back to the mirror, my heart pounding, expecting the figure to reappear. Instead, the glass stared back at me, fractured and dull. Yet, the footprints remained on the dusty floor, as tangible as my fear. The air in the drawing room felt heavier, almost tangible, as if the house itself was holding its breath. A soft rustling drew my attention to the far corner of the room. The once rich draperies shifted, though no breeze stirred them. I moved toward them slowly, the lantern casting flickering shadows on the faded wallpaper. My boots scuffed against the floor, the sound unnervingly loud in the otherwise muted atmosphere. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. Silence. I reached out, grasping the fabric, and yanked it aside. Behind the curtain was nothing but a frost-covered window. I exhaled sharply, the breath visible in the frigid air. Still, the sense of being watched gnawed at me. The faint melody began again. Not from the drawing room, but somewhere deeper within the house. It was unmistakable this time, a music box, delicate and haunting. Each note seemed to carry the weight of long-forgotten sorrow. I followed the sound, stepping cautiously into the hallway. The walls were lined with portraits, their subjects painted with an almost lifelike detail. Men and women in stiff Victorian attire gazed down at me, their eyes following my every move. A child's portrait stood out among them, a girl clutching a doll, her expression eerily solemn. The music grew louder as I neared the staircase. The banister, intricately carved with holly and ivy motifs, was slick with a thin layer of ice. My gloved hand slipped as I ascended, each step groaning beneath my weight. The second-floor corridor was darker than the one below, the windows here completely obscured by frost. At the end of the hallway stood a door, slightly ajar, and from within, the music played on. As I approached, the door creaked open wider, as though inviting me in. My lantern illuminated a small bedroom. A child's bedroom. The wallpaper, once cheerful with images of snowflakes and reindeer, was peeling and stained. A four-poster bed stood against one wall, its canopy sagging. On the bed, perched like an offering, was a small music box. Its lid was open, the tiny ballerina inside spinning gracefully to the tune. I reached for it, hesitating as my fingers brushed the polished wood. The music stopped abruptly, the silence that followed oppressive. Then, from the corner of the room, a sound, a faint giggle, high-pitched and unmistakably childish. I spun toward the source. A rocking horse, dulled with age, moved back and forth, its creaking unsettling in the stillness. I stepped back, the lantern trembling in my grip. The bedroom door slammed shut behind me. The music box sprang to life again, its tune now faster, more discordant. Shadows began to stretch and shift along the walls, taking on shapes that didn't match the room's furnishings. I pressed myself against the door, pulling at the handle, but it refused to budge. The giggle returned, louder now, and closer. A cold breath brushed the back of my neck, sending a shiver down my spine. I turned, raising the lantern, and for a fleeting moment, I saw her. The girl from the portrait, standing by the bed. Her doll dangled limply in one hand, her eyes fixed on mine. They were not the eyes of a child, they were old, knowing, and filled with something I couldn't quite name. She raised a finger to her lips, a universal gesture for silence, and smiled, a smile that sent a wave of dread coursing through me. The music box stopped. The room fell into complete darkness. When the darkness lifted, it wasn't gradual, it snapped away, leaving me disoriented in the stark, moonlit room. The child was gone, the music box closed, and the rocking horse still. The silence pressed against my ears, too thick, too unnatural. I didn't linger. My hand found the door handle, now inexplicably cold, and it yielded under my grip. I stumbled into the hallway, my breath shallow and rapid. The lantern's flame flickered as I turned back toward the staircase, its glow barely cutting through the gloom. But the house wasn't the same. The portraits lining the walls had changed. The figures in them were no longer static but seemed to shift subtly, their faces now half turned toward me, mouths curved into faint smirks or grimaces. My steps faltered as I passed the child's portrait again. Her doll was no longer in her arms, but lay at her feet, its porcelain face cracked, one eye staring accusingly. "Leave." The word came from behind me, not spoken but exhaled, so faint it felt like it emerged from the house itself. I whipped around, the lantern swinging wildly, and caught movement at the far end of the corridor. A figure, a woman, stood in the doorway of another room. Her silhouette was tall and lean, her posture unnaturally rigid. A long dress trailed behind her, its hem brushing the floor. For a moment, I thought her head was bowed, but then I realized she wasn't lowering her gaze. She had none. I froze. She didn't move toward me, didn't gesture. Instead, she stepped back into the room, and the door creaked shut with deliberate slowness. Every nerve in my body screamed to leave, to flee down the stairs and out into the snow-blanketed village. But something about the woman, the void where her face should have been, compelled me to follow. My footsteps were almost involuntary as I approached the door she had vanished through. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single candelabrum on a table, its flames casting tall, flickering shadows. The scent of melted wax mingled with something metallic and faintly sweet. A grand piano dominated the space, its keys covered in dust except for a few that gleamed as if recently touched. As I stepped inside, the door behind me shut, sealing me in. There, by the piano, sat the woman. Her hands rested on the keys, unmoving. Her dress glistened as though it were wet, and her head remained bowed. The lantern revealed more details now. Her dress was not wet but stained, as though she had walked through something dark and viscous. "You shouldn't have come." The words came from her, though her lips, if she had any, did not move. Her voice was a whisper, thin and wavering, like the creak of old timber in the wind. I didn't mean to intrude," I managed, though my voice sounded weak, swallowed by the oppressive air of the room. Her head tilted slightly, almost quizzically. Then her hands moved, pressing a series of notes on the piano. The melody was fractured, broken, and painfully familiar. It was the same tune as the music box, but now played with deliberate menace. As she played, the shadows on the walls began to shift. They weren't reflections of me or the furniture, but figures, dancing, twisting, and contorting as though trapped in some grotesque waltz. The candelabrum flickered violently, its light dimming with each distorted note. My pulse thundered as I backed away toward the door, but it held fast, refusing to open. "Do you know what they did here?" she asked, her tone sharp now, accusatory. I didn't answer. "They sang carols," she continued, her hands still pressing the keys. "They exchanged gifts. They laughed while her voice broke, the piano emitting a discordant crash. The shadows on the wall stilled, and for a moment, I thought they were gone. Then they surged toward me, enveloping the room in darkness again. I felt hands, icy and skeletal, brush against me, tugging at my clothes, my hair. I screamed, dropping the lantern, and the sound echoed unnaturally, growing louder and more distorted until it felt like the house itself was mocking me. Then it all stopped. The lantern's light returned, dim but steady, and the room was empty. The woman, the piano, the candelabrum, all gone. But the shadows on the walls remained, and as I turned to leave, I realized they were no longer just shadows. They were watching. The shadows watched me as I stumbled out of the room, my footsteps clumsy and frantic. The corridor seemed narrower now, the walls pressing inward, but the flickering lantern offered just enough light to guide me forward. I gripped it tightly, my knuckles white, as if its glow could somehow hold the encroaching darkness at bay. Somewhere in the depths of the mansion, a faint sound began to rise. At first, it was indistinguishable, a murmur beneath the creaks and groans of the old structure. But as I crept cautiously down the hallway, it grew clearer, a choir, their voices blending in a carol so hauntingly familiar it chilled my blood. It was silent night. But there was no warmth in their harmony, no peace. The melody was slow, dragging, as if sung by voices weighted with sorrow. The song drew me, beckoned me, and despite the terror coiling in my chest, I followed its pull. The corridor twisted, unfamiliar and labyrinthine, until I found myself standing before a grand double door. Its wood was carved with intricate depictions of holly and ivy, but the patterns were interwoven with jagged lines, like scars across the surface. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. Inside was a ballroom, vast and eerily pristine. A grand chandelier hung overhead, its crystals refracting pale light that didn't seem to come from any discernible source. The room was filled with figures, dozens of them, clad in the fashion of a bygone era. Their faces were obscured either by masks or shadows, and they moved in a slow, deliberate dance. The carol swelled, the voices now distinct and layered. Each note seemed to vibrate through the air, resonating in my bones. I stayed by the door, clutching the frame for support. None of the dancers acknowledged me, their movements mechanical yet unerringly graceful. It was a tableau frozen in time, and yet it pulsed with a sinister vitality. And then I saw her, the woman from before. She stood at the far end of the room, her posture as rigid as ever, her eyeless gaze fixed on me. She lifted an arm, gesturing toward the center of the ballroom, where a massive Christmas tree stood. Its ornaments gleamed, but as I squinted, I realized they were not ornaments at all. They were objects, personal belongings, old and tarnished. A child's shoe, a broken locket, a silver spoon bent out of shape. And beneath the tree, there were presents. Neatly wrapped, tied with ribbons. But the ribbons hung loose, as if whoever tied them had long forgotten how. "Do you know what's inside?" The woman's voice pierced the air, though her lips remained still. I shook my head, unable to find words. "Open them." My body moved against my will, my feet dragging me toward the tree. I knelt, my hands trembling as I reached for the largest box. The paper was brittle, crumbling as I tore it away. Inside was a photograph. Its edges were charred, and the image was blurred, but I could make out the figures, a man, a woman, and a little girl. The girl's face was unmistakable. It was me. My breath hitched, and I dropped the photo as though it burned. The carol grew louder, the dancers moving faster now, their steps a chaotic frenzy. The tree seemed to loom over me, its branches curling downward like grasping claws. "You were never meant to leave," the woman said, her voice resonating from every corner of the room. "This house called you back." Suddenly, the lights of the chandelier dimmed, and the figures around me stopped dancing. Slowly, they turned toward me, their masked faces tilting in unison. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was trapped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The carol had ceased, leaving only the faint rustling of unseen movement in the air. The figures, those masked dancers, stepped toward me, their heads tilting at unnatural angles, as though observing prey. The once static tree behind me groaned as its branches shifted, casting jagged shadows that danced along the walls like malevolent specters. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, though my voice barely carried in the vast, oppressive space. They didn't answer, but one stepped closer, its mask a porcelain visage of a weeping angel. It lifted an arm slowly, extending a hand that was pale and emaciated, its fingers impossibly long. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, only to find myself at the base of the tree. The photo I'd dropped was now nestled among the torn wrapping paper, staring up at me with a mocking familiarity. "This house remembers," the voice of the woman echoed again, disembodied and omnipresent. "And it forgives nothing." I scrambled to my feet, turning wildly in search of an escape, but the dancers closed in, their movements jerky yet precise. I clutched the lantern tighter, its flickering light casting fleeting shadows that offered no comfort. The tree groaned again, and a heavy ornament fell to the floor, shattering with a deafening crash. I glanced down to see what lay among the shards, a small, tarnished pocket watch. My pulse quickened as I recognized the initials etched on its back, HR. They were my father's initials. Memories flooded back in fragments, my father telling stories of Willow Ridge, the house he'd grown up in but never spoke of in detail. His warnings about the place had been vague, shrouded in his usual air of caution. I'd assumed they were the imaginings of an overprotective parent. But now, standing in the very house he'd left behind, I realized I'd walked straight into the heart of something he had feared. The tree's branches snapped downward suddenly, one grazing my shoulder. The fabric of my coat tore, and I stumbled again, the lantern slipping from my grasp and rolling across the floor. The figures moved faster now, their steps pounding in rhythm with the frantic beat of my heart. Their masks shimmered in the dim light, each one revealing a new expression: grief, rage, despair. I grabbed the pocket watch, clutching it as though it might tether me to reality. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "You know," came the reply, softer this time, but filled with an ancient bitterness. The tree's lights flickered, their glow pulsating as if alive. Beneath it, the remaining presents began to shake, their ribbons unraveling as though invisible hands worked to release their contents. From the first box came a small book, its pages yellowed and its spine cracked. A journal. I didn't need to open it to know it was my grandfather's, another relic of the past tied to this cursed house. The second box revealed a lock of hair, tied with a red ribbon. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. And the third, the largest box, split open with a force that sent shards of wood flying. Inside was something far worse than relics. It was a mannequin, its form dressed in what appeared to be my mother's favorite winter coat. The mannequin's face was blank, yet the longer I stared, the more it seemed to take on features I recognized. Features I had seen in the mirror my entire life. "No," I muttered, stepping back. The dancers paused, their heads snapping toward the mannequin. The tree's branches writhed as though agitated, and the air grew thick with a scent I couldn't place, sweet, cloying, and utterly wrong. "This house keeps its own," the woman's voice intoned. "And you are bound by blood to its roots." I turned to run, but the door was still sealed. The dancers began to move again, this time in perfect unison, their movements a macabre ballet that closed the space between us. I was out of options, the walls pressing in and the shadows growing deeper. The lantern's light sputtered and died, leaving only the pulsating glow of the tree to illuminate the nightmare around me. And then I heard it, a faint sound, barely perceptible over the pounding in my ears. It was a child's laugh, high-pitched and eerily familiar. It was my own. The laugh echoed, filling the room with a chilling sense of recognition. It wasn't the innocent sound of a child at play, but something warped, as though joy had been twisted into mockery. My hands trembled, the pocket watch clutched tightly, its tarnished surface warming unnaturally against my skin. The dancers slowed their approach, forming a silent, unmoving semicircle around me. Their masks glowed faintly now, their features shifting and rearranging as though alive. Behind them, the Christmas tree groaned once more, its branches clawing at the ceiling like a creature straining to break free. I turned to the mannequin. Its featureless face was no longer blank. It had become a mirror of my own, its hollow eyes staring directly at me. A strange calm overtook me, laced with dread, as though I had been waiting for this moment all along. The voice of the woman returned, no longer disembodied but emanating from every corner of the room. "The past is never silent, Clara. It demands to be heard." The journal, the lock of hair, the mannequin, and the pocket watch, they were pieces of a story I hadn't wanted to confront. The story of my family and the house they had abandoned but never truly escaped. Summoning every ounce of courage, I reached for the journal. Its pages opened as if guided by an unseen hand, revealing faded writing that bore my grandfather's unmistakable scrawl. I scanned the entries, the truth unraveling with each line. Willow Ridge had been cursed long before my grandfather's time, a curse born of betrayal and greed. My ancestors, once trusted members of the village, had taken in a desperate family on a bitter winter night only to turn them away when resources grew scarce. The family, mother, father, and child, had perished in the snow. Their cries for mercy, my grandfather wrote, had haunted the halls of Willow Ridge ever since. "You carry their burden," the woman's voice said, softer now but tinged with an unrelenting sorrow. I stumbled back, the journal slipping from my grasp. The dancers began to dissolve, their forms unraveling into wisps of smoke that coiled around the tree. The mannequin's face shifted again, becoming that of a child, a girl no older than 6, her expression both innocent and accusing. "Why me?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. The room pulsed with a sudden, violent energy. The clock on the mantel struck 12, each chime reverberating through my chest. With the final toll, the house itself seemed to inhale, the walls shuddering as though alive. "Because you are the last," the voice replied. The tree's lights flared one final time before extinguishing entirely, plunging the room into darkness. I braced myself, expecting the end, a final act of vengeance or punishment. But instead, the darkness receded, replaced by an eerie stillness. The tree was gone, as were the presents, the dancers, and the mannequin. I was alone in the grand hall, the lantern at my feet casting a soft, steady glow. A weight lifted from my chest, but it was replaced by an inexplicable sadness. The house had released me, but not without cost. As I stepped toward the door, it creaked open on its own, revealing the snowy village bathed in moonlight. Outside, the air was crisp, the silence profound. The village seemed unchanged, as though my time in Willow Ridge had been an illusion. Yet, as I glanced back at the house, its windows seemed brighter, no longer shrouded in shadow. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, figures standing in the windows, watching me. They weren't menacing but solemn, their presence a quiet acknowledgement of the past we shared. As I walked away, the pocket watch warmed in my hand. Its faint ticking was steady now, a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the house. The toll of midnight had passed, but the memory of Willow Ridge would remain, a spectral reminder of the ties that bind us to our history and the ghosts we cannot leave behind.